East Street, Episode 14, by Amber Street, Cat and Mouse. When Lenny realized that he had rattled Jack's cage, he knew that he was right in his assumptions about Jack being a cop or a fed. What he didn't know was if Jack was a dirty cop or a dirty federal agent who was dipping into the pot on the side, or if he was undercover. The feds had always been open in their investigations of the family, but that didn't mean that they wouldn't go so low as to put a plant in the family's inner circle. Lenny glanced over at Jack several times during dinner, but Jack never looked back at Lenny. "Gives me indigestion," Lenny said to himself as he wiped his mouth with his napkin and set it on his plate. He stood up and looked at his parents. "I gotta go. I'll see you both in a few days or so." Joey looked at Lenny and quickly wiped his mouth and stood up, even though he wasn't finished eating. "Where are you going?" Genevieve asked Joey. "Oh, well, since Lenny is leaving, I thought that I should too," he said. Genevieve waved her arm and said, "You are like family. Stay." Joey looked over at Lenny. Lenny gave him a stealthy stare and said, "Stay." Jack looked over at Lenny without him noticing. He knew that he was being watched and that Joey was in on it. He wiped his mouth and looked at Joey and Lenny as casually as he could. "Okay, thanks," Joey said. He sat back down. Lenny looked over at Jack and gave him a "don't mess with my family" look. Frederick noticed. He finished chewing and wiped his mouth before he took a sip of red wine. He saw the expression on Jack's face and knew. "He's dirty," Frederick thought to himself. Jack held Lenny's gaze for a moment and grit his teeth. His breath quickened. He was a brave man, but now he was deeply under suspicion, and he knew if he blew this case, his job could be in jeopardy if Lenny didn't kill him first. Lenny saw a moment of fear in Jack's eyes. He gave Jack a cold look and said, "Why don't you come outside with me for a moment, Jack?" Genevieve almost gasped at the request. Lenny had never asked Jack to go outside before. She knew that something was wrong. Genevieve looked at Frederick, who was seated at the head of the table to her right. "What's going on?" she whispered. Frederick reached out his hand and rested it on Genevieve's arm as a way to let her know to remain silent. He nodded his head towards Jack, just as Jack was nodding his head to Lenny and getting up from the table. Jack looked at everyone and nodded his head. "Excuse me." Jack followed Lenny to the back door and stood next to him on the terrace. Lenny looked at the grounds. It was starting to get dark. He looked at Jack and said, "Let's take a walk." Jack nodded. He was not wearing a gun. He never risked it with the family. They were too good at spotting hidden weapons. He walked next to Lenny and followed him down the pathway. It was lit by garden lamps that looked like small, festive, old-fashioned street lamps. Lenny led Jack down the concrete pathway to a small white gazebo. Lenny walked up the steps and sat down on one of the benches. He patted his hand on the bench. "Come sit down." Lenny had a small, satisfied smile on his face. He was enjoying this cat and mouse game, and he was confident that Jack would crumble. Episode 15, East Street, by Amber Street, The Admission. Jack looked at Lenny and walked over to the bench slowly. He looked down at Lenny. "Sit," Lenny said as a command. Jack was angry at himself for not doing a better job with his cover, and angry at Lenny for treating him like a rat. He sat down about a foot away from Lenny and looked at him. "Are you a cop?" Lenny asked. Jack shook his head and said no. Lenny smiled. He kept his eye on Jack. He purposely waited for a few moments before he asked him his next question. "Are you a fed?" Lenny asked as he watched Jack's expression change. As hard as Jack tried, he couldn't keep his expression stone-faced. He was just about to open his mouth and lie when Lenny interrupted him. "Stand up." Jack hesitated. "I said stand up," Lenny ordered. Jack stood up, but he looked straight ahead at the side of the gazebo instead of at Lenny. "Look at me," Lenny ordered. Jack grit his jaw and looked into Lenny's eyes. "Now listen to me. If you lie to me and I find out, you're gonna wish that you never stepped foot in this house. But if you tell the truth, I will give you a merciful death instead of hours of torture. You got me?" Lenny forcefully shook his finger at Jack as he spoke. The look in his eyes was so full of anger that he looked like a fiend. Jack swayed back and almost lost his balance. He steadied himself and looked at Lenny again. Sweat started to form at the back of his neck. He was very disappointed in himself. He had been an agent since his mid-20s, and he had been in many dangerous situations before. He had been called out numerous times, but he had never caved in or blew his cover before. Lenny was a violent man who viewed the violence that he did as something natural. Lenny looked at Jack's eyes. He knew that he had broken him. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you a federal agent? Jack looked into Lenny's eyes and nodded his head. Lenny felt relieved that he was right about his suspicions, and he was relieved that Jack told him the truth, but he was also angry. He decided to control his anger. He leaned forward. He was 2 inches taller than Jack. Are you a dirty Fed? Lenny asked. Jack could not hide his look of surprise. He wanted to say yes in hopes that it would help him, and that Lenny might possibly accept him if he did. But it was too late. Lenny had already seen the look on his face. Well? Lenny asked. Jack felt relief deep inside. He knew that Lenny must have misread his look. He looked at Lenny. His mind raced. Was Lenny just testing him? He had never heard of Lenny or anyone else in the family torturing anyone, but as far as he knew, no one had ever infiltrated the family either. Lenny looked away from Jack and took out his gun. He shoved it in Jack's face at the midway point of his right cheek near his nose with his left hand. I'm gonna only ask you one more time, Lenny said in controlled anger. Are you dirty? Jack felt so much rage inside from having a gun held to his face that he found it easy to lie. Yeah, I'm dirty, Jack said with an intentional angry look. Lenny smiled and put his gun away and said, Good, you work for me now.